Good day everyone, this is Nemesis, and today we are going to take a look at one of the necromancer's hybrid builds for Heart of Thorns. In this guide we will go through a build overview, then we can choose the weapons, utilities and traits. The next step is selecting our gear stats, runes and sigils. And last but definitely not least, we are going to understand when and how to use the Warlock build. That means damage rotation and playstyle, a few optional customization options, and real DPS benchmarks in various scenarios, which will ultimately lead us to some final conclusions. This is a step-by-step configuration in which I will explain the thought process behind every decision, so that in the end, you will have a very in-depth understanding of this build and the necromancer class in general. However, if you are in a hurry, you can just grab the quick link to the build from the description of this video, use the menu to skip the damage rotation and playstyle, and you're good to go. Now, before we begin, I just want to state for the record that even though this requires an insane amount of time and effort, I take pride in being one of the only theory crafters in the Guild Wars 2 community which has done extensive testing of the real DPS values of builds in multiple scenarios. Furthermore, my builds are not designed to have high effectiveness only when in combination with exploits or the abuse of bad gameplay design. And last but definitely not least, despite what you might have heard, there is no best damage build, only best at. So, on to the build overview. In Guild Wars 2, it's a little bit more difficult to measure and classify the effectiveness of a build because there are no predefined roles, or a damage meter for that matter, since the game broke away from the old Holy Trinity system. That is why I have decided to classify the overall effectiveness of builds based on the complexity and difficulty of the engagements. This way you guys will always use the correct build in every encounter, which is by far the most important thing when striving for high effectiveness, as you will soon come to realize. So we have tier 1 builds, which are generally very squishy bursting type builds, who tend to shine in shorter engagements that do not require you to have any form of enhanced survivability in order to maintain 100% DPS uptime, and they also do not have complex mechanics which may severely cripple the effectiveness of your bursting sequence. Tier 2 builds are the hybrids. These builds are also fairly squishy, and they have sacrificed some of their bursting potential in favor of sustained DPS, which is what you need in longer engagements, in places where the mechanics of the encounter would break a bursting sequence. As an example, you have bosses with heavy armor and or perma protection, condition removal, bosses who teleport, stealth, or have various invulnerability effects aimed at power type damage. Tier 3 builds are the heavy duty builds. They are extremely resilient, highly customizable, and they also have the highest sustained DPS. These builds are to be used in places where bursting builds become irrelevant because of the mechanics and duration of the encounter, situations where hybrid builds would perform well if they would manage to survive while maintaining 100% DPS uptime. Because it's all about DPS uptime. So as you've seen, the Warlock is a ranged hybrid build, which means that the most important aspect of the creation process is finding the perfect balance between power type damage and condition type damage, so that they complement each other in a specific damage rotation rather than having one slowing down the other. You never want to be in a situation where, for example, you would actually have higher DPS if you just continue auto-attacking Scepter, instead of switching or adding power type attacks on top of the already stacked conditions. So, with that in mind, we can go ahead and choose our weapons. The axe and the dagger are out of the question by default, since they don't apply any damaging conditions, and the staff, even though it can be considered as a hybrid weapon, since it applies conditions and has power type damage from the auto attack, it lacks both stacking power and consistency, which makes it a support weapon in PvE. So that leaves us with only one option, which is the Scepter. The auto attack is actually a fast hitting 3-chain skill that takes in total, including the aftercast, about 2 seconds to complete. So this skill alone provides plenty of stacking potential, especially when you consider the duration of these conditions. Second skill is Grasping Dead. It has some nice AoE cripple, which enhances kiting capabilities when going against multiple opponents. And if you take a better look, this spell is very useful in a single target DPS rotation as well, since it applies 3 stacks of bleeding for a much longer duration than the Scepter auto attack chain at a faster cast speed. Therefore, this skill should be used on cooldown in any and all situations. Up next we have Fist of Corruption, and once again we can notice right away the extreme condition damage it can stack on targets with 5 pre-existing conditions for its attack speed. 7 stacks of Torment in under 1 second is pretty damn good, and it can also generate up to 13% life force. Now, for the offhand weapon, I opted to go for the dagger, since in more complex fights, which this build was designed for, it's not uncommon to have damaging conditions on you that you can now transfer to your opponent with the aid of Deathly Swarm. We also have Enfeebling Blood, which provides AoE weakness for those longer and more dangerous engagements versus multiple opponents. Now, here is where it's going to get a little bit interesting. The secondary weapon set. We still can't use the dagger, axe or staff because it will severely cripple our DPS rotation if we get stuck with any of them for 10 seconds, but we don't always require the dagger offhand spells, as you will see later on. So while the main hand weapon will always remain the same, and there's another reason why it has to be this way, but more about that later, the offhand can change. But why change it? Well, not only do we get access to more sigils, but also a build which is designed to handle more complex fights needs at least a little bit of boon removal, like the one provided by Spinal Shivers. And besides, even though in this build we are not as life force dependent as we were in the Wraith build, the damage rotation does take us through Death Shroud at some point. So the extra life force generation we get from Reaper's Touch on top of what we already have from Fist of Corruption should cover all our needs, even in longer engagements. Then there's the vulnerability, which directly amplifies all damage done to a target. But more about that later, since it's time to move on to the utilities. Our healing skill is Consume Conditions, because, like I previously stated, in longer and more complex engagements, having conditions on, either done by enemies or self-inflicted, is not uncommon, and Deathly Swarms may just not be enough to deal with them. Our number 7 is Well of Suffering. Due to the fact it's an AoE pulsing type spell, which unlike channeling type spells does not prevent you from using any other skills for its duration, depending on what you add on top of it, it can be used both in a single target DPS rotation and in an AoE DPS rotation. Next, I use Bloody's Power, not only for the 8 might stacks you give to yourself and allies, which is basically your contribution to the initial on-the-fly buffing phase, but also, as you can see, with the right condition duration, it applies 2 bleeding stacks for about 1 minute and self-bleeding for about 20 seconds, and a bit of self-torment. So, when you take into consideration the 20-second cooldown of Bloody's Power, and the fact that the self-bleeding can be sent to your enemy with Deathly Swarm, you'll reach the conclusion that Bloody's Power alone can sustain 6 bleeding stacks on your target, and some torment. Another 6 from Grasping Dead, and you see, things are starting to come together, and it's looking pretty darn good. We just need to remember to invest heavily into condition duration, but more about that later. My number 9 skill is Corrosive Poison Cloud. First of all, this spell destroys projectiles. And if you remember, people were complaining about the necromancer class not having such a skill for a very long time. On top of that, it can sustain between 4 to 8 poison stacks for its duration of 8 seconds, and because of its 20-second cooldown, with the right condition duration, it can sustain perma AoE weakness. As for my elite skill, well, you can't really fit Leech Form into the damage sequence, that skill is more for bursting builds, and you don't really need the survivability from Plague, so might as well go for some extra pew pew damage from the Flash Golem. Okay, Now we are going to move on to the traits to find ways to further amplify the effectiveness of our desired playstyle. And we are going to start from the condition side of the hybrid build. You saw that in the mix we use 2 corruption skills, and that their duration and cooldown is relevant to our playstyle. Master of Corruption is in fact the reason why both of these skills are on a 20-second cooldown, down from 30 seconds, and also the reason why they have self-torment and self-vulnerability. Now, I know some people see this as an unwanted side effect to an otherwise extremely strong trait, but it's actually not. You see, my friends, because of the added self-torment and self-weakness, you will meet the threshold required to trigger Plague Sending. And Plague Sending is also very important in this build, because with it you no longer have to camp dagger so that you're always ready to transfer conditions from self to your enemy. You can now weapon swap as part of the damage rotation without any worries whatsoever. Now, part of the reason why Fist of Corruption applies perma 7 stacks of Torment and why Grasping Dead Bleeding lasts for 30 seconds is Lingering Curse, which gives us 50% condition duration on all Scepter skills, which is insane. And also you have perma 150 extra condition damage stat while wielding a Scepter. This is that other reason why we don't change out of the Scepter main hand that I was talking about during weapon selection, because that 150 extra condition damage remains even in Death Shroud. And I did say that our damage rotation will take us through Death Shroud at some point, if you remember. Why do we go through Death Shroud? Well, we've put the bleeding, the poison, the torment, and some more bleeding on the target, so all that is left is to Scepter auto attack, since everything is now on cooldown. But that would make us a full condition build, and we are going for a hybrid build. And for that we need to add some direct type damage, but we can't really switch out of the Scepter without crippling our condition side of the build. However, we can go into Death Shroud and do some Life Blast hits, which are much stronger than regular Scepter auto attacks in terms of power type damage, and also burn the target. And the burning is about the same DPS as the bleeding from the Scepter auto attacks, so we don't actually stop or hinder our condition side of the hybrid build. Same DPS, but shorter duration. That's why we first add the bleeds, and then we complement that with the heavy life blast hits and burning on top of the bleeds. Besides, it's not like we can stay in Death Shroud indefinitely anyway. Now, the real question at this point is, why even go hybrid in the first place? Isn't it easier and perhaps even more effective to be full condition monster instead? That's a very good question. Glad I asked it. It may be true that in quite a few cases going full condition monster will yield higher personal DPS because of the duration and mechanics of the fight, but overall in high level fractals the hybrid is still more effective because of the vulnerability. Every life blast hit now applies 2 vulnerability stacks from Unyielding Blast. We also apply 3 stacks of vulnerability on target every 3 seconds while in Death Shroud from Rending Shroud. And there's that whole thing about applying vulnerability on targets under 33% health from Death's Embrace. So as you can see, most of the vulnerability comes from spells and traits that are normally related to power type builds. The fact it lasts 18 seconds on the target is from the condition duration we have for the condition side of the build, which normally you wouldn't use in a power type build. So you see, the Necromancer's hybrid build is one of the few builds out there which can sustain on its own 25 stacks of vulnerability on the target indefinitely without crippling the build in any way, shape or form. You will never suffer from a lack of vulnerability in raids since there are 10 people involved, but when it comes to high level fractals, teams of only 5 players, over 1 minute fights with complex mechanics and so on, you will see that more often than not there will be a shortage of vulnerability on target. And that's where this build comes in. This is your ultimate contribution to the part. From the power side of this build, you will also obtain some nice self-might stacking from Reaper's Might and Siphon Power, especially versus targets under 50% health, which, considering the build is designed for about 1 minute engagements, will take a lot of pressure off of a dedicated buff. Now, Just like we need condition duration for the condition side of the build, we need damage modifiers for the power side of the build. 20% damage increase versus targets under 50% health from close to death. Another 5% on foes with no boons from Spiteful Talisman, which also reduces the cooldown of focus skills by 20%. And we use Vital Persistence to reduce the cooldown of skills like Tainted Shackles and Life Transfer for the AoE damage rotation. And to have our life force degenerate slower, so that you benefit from another 5% damage increase from Strength of Undeath for a longer period of time. So you saw that the common ground between the power side and the condition side in this build was the spell Life Blast treated with Dumbfire. Now we need a common ground stat-wise as well, so that we know where to start from as we prepare to move on to the gear. We know that Precision, aka Critical Strike Chance, is mostly used for power builds since conditions can't crit. But with traits like Bar Precision, critical hits can generate additional stacking power. Furthermore, we also have Target the Weak, which gives us condition damage stat based on our precision, and also gives us 2% critical strike chance for every unique condition on your opponent. At this moment in time, there are 13 conditions that the players can apply, but we are only interested in the ones which can be sustained on the target. So we have Perma Bleeding, Weakness, Torment, Vulnerability, Cripple, Poison, that this build can apply. And there's also Burning, which will most definitely be on target from multiple sources. And Confusion or Chill, which are more situational but are still worth taking into consideration. Overall, about 8-9 conditions. Let's go with 8. Which translates into 16% critical strike chance increase. Now, we all know that 100% critical strike chance is ideal, not just to always crit with your power type attacks, but it also helps with stacking. However, we must also be very careful not to go into an overkill. So, from that 100% max value, we take out 60% we get from Target the Weak, another 20% off to account for Fury, another 8% for Banner of Discipline, and another 7% to account for Spotter, both of which are quite common. That's a total of 51%, which means that the sweet spot for critical strike chance is without a doubt somewhere around 50%. Okay? Okay. The second most important stat to max out is, you heard me say this many times already, with the right condition duration. Well, the right condition duration is actually somewhere around 80% for the Perma Weakness, Perma Torment from Fist of Corruption, 5-second burns, and hitting the 100% bleeding duration cap with Bar Precision. The other stats we are looking for are of course raw power and raw condition damage. So, in order to achieve these exact values, you need to have 5 pieces of Viper armor and Sinister boots. Viper weapons and Viper amulet, complemented with Rampager backpiece, earrings and rings. You also need 2 runes of the Trapper for an extra 10% condition duration, and 4 runes of the Tempest for an extra 50% condition duration, and a bit of power, condition damage, precision and ferocity, complemented with Rare Veggie Pizza and Toxic Focusing Crystal. The only thing that is left to select are the sigils. Here is where you will finally understand why I have prioritized condition duration over condition damage stat. Why I have always said condition duration is much more valuable than raw condition damage in PvE. We take a look at Superior Sigil of Earth. With 100% bleeding duration, it applies 10-second bleeds. It has a 2-second cooldown, so that means it can sustain about 4 bleeds on average. Now, let's assume that we can sustain about 20 bleeding stacks. At 1710 condition damage and 25 stacks of might, the DPS is 3392. If I were to replace this sigil with Superior Sigil of Corruption, as in drop 4 stacks in favor of 250 more raw condition damage, my DPS from bleeding would drop all the way down to 2954. So, because of how the condition damage stat scales in the damage formula, stacking power will always take priority over raw condition damage. And high condition duration is the #1 requirement for high stacking power. So this is why we always max out our condition duration in PvE. This is why we take Superior Sigil of Earth on Scepter, since we never swap out of it, and it can also proc while in Death Shroud. As for the offhand weapons which we do swap, Superior Sigil of Geomancy, 3 bleeding stacks for 20 seconds on weapon swap, with a 10-second cooldown. And by the way, entering Death Shroud counts as a weapon swap, so you can be sure that the Sigil will always proc on cooldown. So when we draw the line, we have 2847 power and 2460 condition damage at 25 stacks of might, up to 100% critical strike chance in party scenarios, 151 critical strike damage with about 30% more overall damage from damage modifiers, and 100% bleeding duration, 80% all condition duration, which enables us to generate perma weakness, perma max vulnerability, and so on. Heavy debuffing stuff. Now, before we move on to the damage rotation and playstyle, just a few customization options. If you're not in a condition heavy encounter, you can opt to take Blood Fiend instead of Consume conditions. And for AoE, if there is at least one other condition user in the party, it is recommended that you change Corrosive Poison Cloud into Epidemic, since it spreads up to a cap of 25 stacks, any and all conditions on the target to 5 nearby targets, while taking advantage of your condition damage and duration. This spell, based on its potential max DPS output, is literally by far the highest hitting skill in the game. So we are going to start with the AoE damage rotation first, just to get it out of the way. Like we talked about during weapon selection, you initiate on the mob pack with Grasping Dead for the cripple and the 3 bleeding stacks, followed up by Enfeebling Blood for the weakness and 2 more bleeding stacks. Since your team probably plays some negative conditions on the enemies as well by now, you select the monster, preferably the one with the most conditions on, and you put 7 stacks of Torment with Fist of Corruption. Then you use Blood's Power to further increase the bleeding while providing AoE might, and Epidemic on that mob, which will basically more than double all the damage you have done so far on the entire mob pack. At this point you will have quite a few negative conditions on you, which will be automatically transferred to your enemies as soon as you place your Well of Suffering down for the added damage and initial vulnerability stacking. Immediately after this you go into Death Shroud, which will trigger your Sigil of Geomancy for 3 more AoE bleeding stacks, and Fury from Furious Demise, which will make your well do even more damage, and while continuously applying even more AoE vulnerability on the mob pack from Rending Shroud, you use Tainted Shackles for the damage and Immobilize, since the monster pack might be getting dangerously close by now even while crippled, and Life Transfer, which should keep your life force pull up even if you take a few glancing blows. If by any chance any monsters remain standing at this point, you can finish them off with a few Life Blast hits. So it's Grasping Dead plus Enfeebling Blood into Fist of Corruption, Blood's Power, and Epidemic everything. Then Well of Suffering into Death Shroud, where you Tainted Shackles plus Life Transfer. And finish off with a few Life Blast hits. Now, the single target damage rotation. The single target damage rotation is actually pretty similar to the AoE damage rotation because of the dual nature of the spells on the hotbar. But since this is a sustained DPS rotation made for longer, more complex fights, it's less of an exact sequence and more of a priority of combo skills to use on cooldown. So since we know we apply power type damage on top of the condition type damage, and it's generally recommended to start with the high cooldown skills first so that you can use other damaging skills as they are refreshing, obviously. We go Blood's Power and Corrosive Poison Cloud for perma weakness, the 1 minute bleeding stacks and 4 to 8 stacks of poison. This should also give you 4 conditions on self, which you will send to your enemy by triggering Plague Signet with Reaper's Touch. It's an under 1 second skill which hits 4 times, so really high chance of triggering. Then it's Grasping Dead and Fist of Corruption, since they have the same cooldowns, for an extra 3 bleeding stacks and 7 stacks of Torment. Now that we've put the conditions down, it's time to transition into some power type damage as we further debuff the target with vulnerability. So Well of Suffering before entering Death Shroud, which will trigger Sigil of Geomancy for 3 extra bleeding stacks and Fury from Furious Demise. And we proceed to do 6 Life Blast hits, 9 if you have Quickness on, for the power type damage, burning and of course vulnerability. Now by the time we exit Death Shroud, Grasping Dead and Fist of Corruption should be off of cooldown, followed shortly by Reaper's Touch. Having nothing left to do at this point, you weapon swap, which will trigger Sigil of Geomancy once again, because Blood's Power and Corrosive Poison Cloud is almost off of cooldown as well. However, this time, after using these two skills, since 30 seconds have not yet passed, Plague Sending will not activate. That's why you do a full scepter auto attack as you wait for the self weakness to expire, so that you can send the other 3 remaining conditions to your enemy with Deathly Sword. We're almost done. It's time for Grasping Dead and Fist of Corruption once again, into Death Shroud 6 to 9 life blast hits, and by the time you get out, you'll be exactly where you started from at the beginning of this damage sequence. Going to say it with you guys one more time, more fluently. Blood's Power, Corrosive Poison Cloud, Reaper Stage, Grasping Dead, Fist of Corruption, Well of Suffering into Death Shroud 6 to 9 life blasts, Grasping Dead, Fist of Corruption, Reaper Stage, Weapon Swap, Blood's Power, Corrosive Poison Cloud, 1 full scepter auto attack, Deathly Swarm, Grasping Dead, Fist of Corruption into 6 to 9 life blast hits, and that's it. I assume it will take you guys a while to get used to the damage rotation, but it is definitely worth it, as you will soon find out. Now that you know how to use this build, you just need to understand when to use it and why, which, as I stated in the beginning, is the most important part in this guide. So we are going to move on to the real DPS benchmarks. So from the previous guide we have learned that there are massive variations in DPS output based on the mechanics of the engagement and the quickness uptime, obviously. Which means that any and all spreadsheet math calculations are 100% irrelevant. You might have also noticed that I never modified my damage sequence to account for alacrity, since, as I have said last time, the boon is severely imbalancing the game by overly increasing the effectiveness of builds with high damage channeling skills. A good example of that is Goku's 25k DPS on Bloomhanger with perma alacrity and perma quickness. So the fact that ArenaNet is nerfing alacrity by 100% will have little to no consequences on the effectiveness of this build. Now, on Bloomhanger difficulty scale 56, in my best attempt with 95% quickness uptime, I did 1,373,945 damage in 79.9 seconds, which is a DPS of 17,183. Now, there are two very important points that I want to make here. First, if you are going to compare the Hybrid's DPS to my Bursting build's DPS on Bloomhanger, you might be inclined to think that the Warlock build is superior to the Wraith build, since it seems to have out-DPS'd it even on a target that had light armor. But it's not actually that simple. Watch this. In my Wraith Bloomhanger fight, I only had 60% quickness uptime. If I would have had 95% quickness uptime, the Wraith build would have had higher DPS, since 35% quickness difference translates roughly in 17% DPS increase. Now, we know the Wraith build's DPS drops in longer than 40-second engagements, which means that in Fractal 40 and above, it cannot compete with the Warlock build regardless of the quickness uptime, because all fights last longer than 1 minute due to the progressive increase of toughness and HP on bosses. But we also know the Hybrid build has a ramp-up time of about 10 to 15 seconds, which makes it ineffective in fights that last 15 to 30 seconds in total. So this is why in dungeons and lower level fractals we go Wraith, and in higher level fractals we go Warlock, if we want to have maximum possible effectiveness. The second point I want to make is that the reason why I had the higher quickness uptime than last time was because I did not use the meta team composition. Those of you who are familiar with my work so far already know what I think about the so-called meta, which in the past made people struggle to obtain 2k DPS on the Flame Shaman boss, even while using 6 Ice Bows, back when Ice Bow Ice Storm spell was doing 80k DPS for 3.7 seconds, totaling in about 300,000 damage on Bloomhanger. So I saw some people ask me about team composition in the comment section of my last video, and my answer will be the same as always. There is no best damage build, there is no best damage composition, only best at. However, if you're going to go for quickness with a Mesmer, you might also want to bring a Revenant with you for Facet of Nature, especially in longer fights. facet of nature, fudge. Now, I was previously talking about higher level fractals, yet the footage you see here is from fractal 60. That's because fractal 60 to 70 is actually the worst matchup for the hybrid build because of the sluggish instability, which reduces the recharge time of skills if you have a condition on. And that's a really big DPS loss considering that in this build we frequently apply conditions to ourselves. Not to mention there's also the afflicted instability which randomly applies conditions to you and you might just get chain feared at one point. But even with all that, in my best all-time fight with 85% quickness uptime, I managed to do 844,586 damage in 64.8 seconds, which is a DPS of 13k. Higher DPS than what the Wraith build had. The armor of the bosses is really starting to make a difference. And when you also add other mechanics into the equation like protection and invulnerability versus power type attacks, you can expect an even higher variation in DPS for pure power builds, like from 15k on Bloomhanger all the way down to 4k on the legendary champion Shaman. This is where you will understand what I have said in my last guide. From this point forward, you have passed into the realm of hybrid builds. You see, the condition side of my hybrid build is not affected by any of these mechanics. So in the legendary champion Shaman fight, I managed to do with 8% quickness uptime 634,152 damage in 63.9 seconds, which is a DPS of 9,771. By the way, even though you can see a damage meter in some of my footage, the damage numbers being displayed on screen throughout this video have been calculated by me manually. Because after extensive testing, I have reached the conclusion that the damage meter is still not 100% reliable, since it can't always keep up with the damage numbers being displayed on screen when there is quickness involved. Now, one of my biggest highlights I had with this build was during Captain Zashim fight, which we did without the aid of the NPCs so I can get more accurate statistics. As it turns out, I was half the team's damage, registering at 1,005,690 damage in 93.6 seconds. That's a DPS of 10,743. Even though I went down towards the end of the fight. This is what it means to use the correct build for the encounter. So, based on everything you have seen so far, you can understand why I say that the Warlock is the ultimate necromancer damage hybrid. This may very well be the best guide I have ever made. It may also be my last. Yeah, I know that's what I always say, but the thing is, there is absolutely no way I can make this kind of high quality content any faster. We're talking about dozens of hours of in-game testing, dozens of hours of recording and editing in Sony Vegas and Photoshop. Merely calculating the damage numbers for a single encounter takes anywhere from 30 to 60 minutes. And last but not least, the over 6,000 carefully selected words aimed at delivering the most comprehensive guide possible. Overall, it takes about 20 days if everything goes smoothly, but when you consider YouTube rewarded me for my last guide with about $10, you can understand why I say that my patrons are at this point literally the only reason why I'm making this. So if you guys wish to support me in making more of this type of content, you can find a link to my Patreon page in the description of this video, alongside the menu for easy browsing, the quick link to the build, my Facebook page, and direct links to any other similar builds. But until next time, enjoy your gaming and have a great day.